Hello and welcome to my presentation entitled The Train to Paradise, Henry Flagler and His Dream of a Railroad to Key West. Before we start with the railroad story, let's set the scene with a quick geological history of the Florida Keys. The Keys are a coral archipelago located off the southern coast of Florida, forming the southernmost part of the continental United States. They begin at the southeastern coast of the Florida Peninsula, about 15 miles south of Miami, and extend in a gentle arc south-southwest and then westward to Key West, the westernmost of the inhabited islands, and on to the uninhabited dry Tortugas. The northern and central sections of the Florida Keys are the exposed portions of an ancient coral reef, the Key Largo limestone that formed approximately 370,000 years ago when sea levels were much higher than today. The Florida Keys have taken their present form as the result of the drastic changes in sea level associated with recent glaciations or ice ages. Beginning some 130,000 years ago, the Sangamonian stage raised the sea levels about 25 feet above the current level. Starting about 100,000 years ago, the Wisconsin glaciation began lowering sea levels, exposing the coral reef and surrounding marine sediments. Henry Morrison Flagler, born January 2nd, 1830, died May 20th, 1913. He was an American industrialist and a founder of Standard Oil, Ohio. He was also a key figure in the development of the Atlantic coast of Florida and founder of what became the Florida East Coast Railway. He is also known as the father of Miami and of Palm Beach, Florida. Before we discuss the railroad story, let's get a little family background. Henry Flagler was born in Hopewell, New York, the son of Isaac Flagler, a Presbyterian minister, and his wife, the widowed Elizabeth Caldwell Harkness. She had brought two sons to the marriage with Flagler from her previous marriage to the late David Harkness of Milan, Ohio. Flagler attended local Flagler and his brother-in-law tried their hand in the salt business in Michigan to live and work with his paternal uncle, and he returned to Bellevue in 1866 and Republic, Ohio. The grain business. He recruited the young Henry to join him, and the youth went to Ohio at age 14. Through this business, Flagler became acquainted with John D. Rockefeller, a salary of $5 per month commission plus room and board with Hewitt and Tuttle. By 1949, Flagler was promoted by the mid-1860s salary. Cleveland had become the center of the oil refining industry in the grain business, and Rockefeller left the grain business to start his own refinery. Needing capital for his new venture, Rockefeller approached Flagler in 1867. Flagler's stepbrother, Stephen Harkness, invested $100,000, equivalent to about $1.83 million in today's money, on the condition that Flagler be made a partner. The Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler partnership was formed with Flagler in control of Harkness's interest. The partnership eventually grew into the Standard Oil Corporation, and by 1872, Standard Oil led the American oil refining industry, producing some 10,000 barrels per day. In 1877, Flagler and his family moved to New York City, which was becoming the center of commerce in the U.S. In 1885, Standard Oil moved its corporate headquarters to New York City to the iconic 26 Broadway location. In 1878, On the advice of his physician, Flagler traveled to Jacksonville, Florida for the winter with his first wife, Mary, whose maiden name was Harkness, who was quite ill. She eventually died in 1881. In 1883, he married Mary's former caregiver, Ida Alice Shords. After their wedding, the couple traveled to St. Augustine. Flagler found the city charming, but the hotel facilities and transportation systems very inadequate. Franklin W. Smith had just finished building the Villa Zorada, now a museum on King Street in St. Augustine, and Flagler offered to buy it for his honeymoon. Smith would not sell, but he planted the seed of St. Augustine and Florida's future in Flagler's mind. As a matter of interest, Franklin W. Smith was an American idealistic reformer who made his fortune as a Boston hardware merchant. He was an early abolitionist, author, and architectural enthusiast who proposed transforming Washington, D.C. into a, quote, capital of beauty and cultural knowledge. Although Flagler remained on the board of directors of Standard Oil, he gave up his day-to-day involvement in the corporation to pursue his interests in Florida. Flagler returned to St. Augustine in 1885 and made Franklin W. Smith an offer. If Smith could raise $50,000, Flagler would invest $150,000, that is, and they would build a hotel together. Perhaps fortunately for Smith, he couldn't come up with the funds, so Flagler began construction of the 54-room Ponce de Leon hotel by himself, but eventually spent several times his original estimate. Ida's mood swings and her preoccupation with Ouija boards and a deepening delusion that she was actually married to the Tsar of Russia, Ida became a problem, which I bet she would have done for anybody. So in 1896, at age 51, she was institutionalized. At the same time, he began to have a relationship with Mary Lily Keenan. In 1899, Flagler had created a strong enough acquaintance with Mary Lily that the papers began to openly question whether the two were having an affair. That year, he reportedly gave to her more than $1 million in jewelry. In 1901, Flagler convinced the Florida legislature and the governor to pass a law that made incurable insanity grounds for divorce, opening the way for Flagler to remarry. Flagler was the only person to be divorced under this law before it was repealed in 1905. A spouse's mental incapacity was later restored by the legislature as a grounds for dissolution of marriage and remains the law of Florida today. On August 24, 1901, 10 days after his divorce, Flagler married Mary Lily. White Hall in Palm Beach, Florida, was built as a wedding present to Mary Lily in 1902 and designed by architects John Carrere and Thomas Hastings. White Hall became the Flagler's winter home. With more than 100,000 square feet and 75 plus rooms, White Hall was described in 1902 by the New York Herald as more wonderful than any palace in Europe, grander and more magnificent than any other private dwelling, that is, in the world. We'll discuss White Hall again later in the presentation. White Hall Winter Retreat established the Palm Beach, quote, season of about 8 to 12 weeks for the wealthy of America's Gilded Age. Today, White Hall houses the Flagler Museum. I think that's enough about the Flagler's private life and his wives, so let's turn our attention now to his railroad activities. Flagler realized that the key to developing Florida was a solid transportation system, and consequently purchased the 3-foot narrow gauge Jacksonville, St. Augustine and Halifax River Railway on December 31st, 1885. He also discovered that a major problem facing the existing Florida railway systems was that each operated on a different gauge system, making interconnection impossible. So what did he do? He converted the line to 4-foot 8.5 inch, that's known as standard gauge, in 1890, and the small operation was incorporated in 1892. In 1883, Henry Flagler, now retired from Standard Oil, moved to St. Augustine, built the previously mentioned Ponce de Leon and Alcazar hotels, and purchased the Casa Monica just east of the Alcazar, changing the name to Cordova. The east coast of Florida was relatively undeveloped at the time, and Flagler found it difficult to obtain the construction material he needed. His purchase of the Jacksonville, St. Augustine and Halifax River Railway was intended to make it faster and easier to supply his building projects. That railroad, the Jacksonville, St. Augustine and Halifax River Railway, served the northeastern portion of the state and was the first operation in the Flagler Railroad system. Before Flagler bought the line, the railroad stretched only between South Jacksonville and St. Augustine and lacked a depot sufficient to accommodate travelers to his St. Augustine resorts. In 1893, Flagler built a modern depot facility, as well as schools, hospitals, and churches, systematically revitalizing the largely abandoned historic city. Flagler next purchased 3 additional existing railroads, the St. John's Railway, the St. Augustine and Palatka Railway, and the St. John's and Halifax River Railway, so that he could provide extended rail service on standard gauge tracks. Through the operation of these 3 railroads, by spring of 1889, Flagler's system offered service from Jacksonville to Daytona, continuing to develop hotel facilities to entice northern tourists to visit Florida. Flagler bought and expanded the Ormond Hotel, located along the railroad's route north of Daytona in Ormond Beach. On November the 24th, 1980, the Ormond Hotel was added to the U.S. National Register of Historic Places. However, in 1992, the structure was razed to the ground to make way for a condominium. The original cupola now stands in a riverfront park directly west of the site of the former hotel. Red locations on the map show Flagler's hotels and railroads as they eventually became. The green locations on the map depict the hotels and railroads of Henry Bradley Plant, who was born in 1819, died in 1899. He will be the subject of a future presentation. Beginning in 1892, after landowners south of Daytona had petitioned him to extend the railroad 80 miles further south, Flagler began laying new railroad tracks, no longer following his traditional practice of purchasing existing railroads and merging them into his growing rail system. As the railroad progressed southward, cities such as New Smyrna and Titusville began to develop along the tracks. By 1894, Flagler's railroad system reached what is today known as West Palm Beach. He constructed the Royal Ponciana Hotel in Palm Beach overlooking the Lake Worth Lagoon. He also built the Breakers Hotel on the ocean side of Palm Beach and White Hall, his private 55-room, 60,000 square foot winter home. The development of these 3 structures, coupled with the railroad access to them, established Palm Beach as a winter resort for the wealthy members of America's Gilded Age. This picture is of Whitehall, the Flagler winter residence, which has now become the home of the Flagler Museum in Palm Beach, and it is well worth a visit. The current house in no way reflects how the house was in Flagler's day, though. When it was sold by his heirs, it became a hotel with many modifications that were made to the original building. The hotel development, coupled with railroad access to them, established Palm Beach as a winter resort for the wealthy members of America's Gilded Age. The period in United States history following the Civil War and Reconstruction, lasting from the late 1860s to 1896, is referred to as the Gilded Age. This term was coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in their book The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, published in 1873. The winter of 1894-5 caused much damage to the Florida orange crop. The fable that Julia Tuttle, one of two main landowners in the Miami area, along with the Brickell family, sent orange blossoms to Flagler to prove him that Miami, unlike the rest of the state, was unaffected by the frost, is an untrue story. However, the truth is that she wired him to advise him that the region around the shores of Biscayne Bay is untouched by the freezes. He sent his two lieutenants, James Ingraham and Joseph Parrott, to investigate. They brought boxes of produce and citrus back to Flagler, who then wired Tuttle asking, "Madam, what is it that you propose?" To convince Flagler to continue the railroad to Miami, both Tuttle and Brickell offered half of their holdings north and south of the Miami River to him, Flagler that is. Tuttle added 50 acres for shops and yards if Flagler would extend his railroad to the shores of Biscayne Bay and build one of his great hotels. An agreement was made and contracts were signed. On September the 7th, 1895, the name of Flagler's railroad system was changed from the Jacksonville, St. Augustine and Indian River Railway Company to the Florida East Coast Railway Company. By the way, Julia Tuttle is the only woman to found a major American city. That's a rather good bit of trivia. On April the 15th, 1896, track reached Biscayne Bay, the site of present-day downtown Miami. At the time, it was a small settlement of less than 50 inhabitants. When the town incorporated on July the 28th, 1896, its citizens wanted to honor the man responsible for the city's development by naming it Flagler. He declined the honor, persuading them to retain its old Indian name, Miami. The area was actually previously known as Fort Dallas, after the fort that was built there in 1836 during the Second Seminole War. To further develop the area surrounding the Miami Railroad Station, Flagler dredged a channel, built streets and the Royal Palm Hotel, instituted the first water and power systems, and financed the town's first newspaper, known as the Metropolis. Opened on January the 16th, 1897, the Royal Palm Hotel was one of the first hotels in the Miami area. It sat on the north bank of the Miami River, where it overlooked Biscayne Bay. 5 stories tall with a 6-floor salon. The Royal Palm Hotel featured the city's first electric lights, elevators, and a swimming pool. Almost 30 years later, the Royal Palm Hotel was badly damaged by the 1926 hurricane and later infested with termites. In 1930, it was condemned and torn down. Soon after the turn of the century, news came that the United States was preparing to build the long-discussed Panama Canal. As Flagler saw it, the benefit of the canal could be accomplished in only one way, and that was by carrying his rails to a deep water harbor. Beyond the Miami River, 156 miles southward, lay Key West, then many times greater in size than Miami, and possessing a harbor capable of accommodating some of the largest ships currently afloat. This appears to have been the major factor in Flagler's decision to push the Florida East Coast Railway all the way down to Key West. Flagler became particularly interested in linking Key West to the mainland after the construction of the Panama Canal was announced by the U.S. in 1905. As the closest deep-water port in the U.S. to the canal, Key West was positioned to take advantage of significant new trade with the West that would be enabled by the opening of the canal. This, in addition to the city's existing involvement with Cuban and Latin American trade. Key West could accommodate vessels having a draft of 30 feet and was the deepest harbor south of Norfolk, Virginia. At this time, Key West was the largest town in Florida. Flagler sought perhaps his greatest challenge, the extending of the Florida East Coast Railway to Key West, a city of almost 20,000 inhabitants located 128 miles beyond the end of the Florida Peninsula. During 1904, Flagler started what everybody considered a folly, that being the extension of the Florida East Coast Railway to Key West, which would later become known as the Overseas Railroad, at the time considered the eighth wonder of the world and surely the most daring infrastructure project ever built, and especially exclusively with private funds. In the summer of 1902, Flagler engaged a group of young and hardy engineers and sent them into the region south of Miami to conduct preliminary surveys. Under the direction of location engineer William H. Crome of Illinois, then a young man of only 26, surveys were made of possible routes. During 1902 and 1903, Crome conducted a survey to Cape Sable, now part of the Everglades National Park. He mapped for the first time parts of the Everglades that had not previously been known. In 1904, he surveyed a route for the Key West extension from Homestead to Key Largo via Card Point and then to Key Largo via Jewfish Creek, discovering Lake Surprise, which also appeared on no maps. Another survey was made to the Narrows dividing Biscayne Bay and Barnes Sound, thence across Key Largo to Turtle Harbor, where expensive terminal facilities would be necessary. It is said, with the engineer's reports before him, Flagler called in his vice president of the railroad, Mr. Joseph R. Parrott, and asked him if he was sure the railroad could be built. After careful study on the recommendations of the engineers and Mr. Parrott, both the Cape Sable and the Turtle Harbor proposals were abandoned. Mr. Flagler reached his decision to build the railroad over the Keys. The titanic struggle to extend the railroad to Key West began in 1904 when engineers staked their right-of-way through the Everglades and the swamps and jungles and shark-infested waters over the 128-mile route from Homestead to Key West. Many considered this to be Flagler's folly. The man chosen to take charge of the project was Joseph Carroll Meredith, who took up his work as chief constructing engineer on the 26th of July, 1904. Meredith came from Indiana, was a noted bridge engineer whose construction experience eminently qualified him for the stupendous undertaking. His latest project was the construction of docks at Tampico, Mexico, for the Mexican government. Meredith was small of stature, but a man of great energy, resourcefulness, determination, and courage. He was intolerant of inefficiency or indifference. From early morning until late night, his every thought seemed to be of the railroad. He pushed himself relentlessly and ever sought to spur his assistants to greater efforts. Eventually, the pace was too much for him, and on April the 20th, 1909, after nearly 5 years of driving effort, with little time off from his labors, he died suddenly. Henry Flagler and the entire senior leadership of the Florida East Coast Railway attended Meredith's funeral. Flagler reportedly took his passing very hard. So hard, in fact, that in Flagler's wallet, at the time of his own death more than 4 years later, they found Meredith's obituary. Meredith worked nearly until the day of his death, growing dangerously weak as he urged work along the railway forward. He was brought back to Miami and died, succumbing to a diabetic condition known only by his family. His wife, Ella Lane, died 5 months and 4 days later. Meredith was succeeded by his principal assistant engineer, Mr. William J. Crome, who, as mentioned earlier, had been in charge of the original surveys. No better man could have been found for the great tasks that lay ahead. Educated at the University of Illinois and Cornell University, Crome had spent several years on railroad engineering projects in Missouri and elsewhere before coming to Florida. Crome was a brilliant engineer and a tireless worker. Under his direction, all obstacles were overcome and the work was carried successfully to completion. He married Isabel G. Burns in 1910 and they had 4 children. William Crome died on October 2nd, 1929. After leaving Florida City, 2 miles south of Homestead, the route traverses about 19 miles of the Everglades to Jewfish Creek. From there, it traverses some 29 islands before reaching the island of Key West. Because of the formation of these islands, the route crosses 43 bodies of water, ranging all the way up to 7 miles in length. Construction commenced from Homestead southward. Construction commenced from Homestead southward in the summer of 1905, and in December 1907, the rails reached Knights Key, 83 miles below Homestead. Here, in the Knights Key Channel, indicated by the blue arrow on the map, a large dock, reached by a long wooden trestle, was nearing completion. Knights Key Dock was opened February 6, 1908, and a passenger train service was extended southward to that point on the same day. For the next 4 years, until the railroad was completed into Key West on January the 22nd, 1912, this was an important terminal where trains from the north met the Peninsular and Occidental Steamship Company's ships plying to and from Havana, Cuba. During that period, Knights Key Dock was a port of entry with customs officials in charge. It also had a post office. Over Knights Key Dock traveled many of the distinguished people of the time en route to and from Cuba. Today, not a vestige of the dock is to be seen. The 3 major bridges are pictured from south to north, or if you prefer, left to right on the map, those being Bahia Honda, the 7-mile bridge, and the Long Key Viaduct. On the 106-mile route between Jewfish Creek and Key West, the route traverses 37 miles of water, nearly all of which is open sea. About 20 miles of the line were bridged by the construction of fills or embankments, and 17 miles were bridged by concrete viaducts and concrete and steel bridges. All told, there are 37 permanent structures of this kind, 29 concrete viaducts, 6 concrete and steel structures, and 3 drawbridges. Long Key Viaduct, the first bridge to be built, presented many formidable problems, some of which were unique, unprecedented, the solution of which taxed the ingenuity of the engineers. The experience gained from this project proved to be of great benefit in the construction of the other bridges. Long Key Viaduct is a reinforced concrete structure. It consisted originally of 180 50-foot arches, to which 42 35-foot arches were added before the railroad was opened, bringing its total length up to 11,958 feet, or 2.15 miles. The weather took its toll on many pieces of floating equipment employed on the Long Key project. They were either sunk or otherwise destroyed. Others were badly damaged. One boat, on which about 150 men were housed, broke away from its moorings and went out to sea, where it was buffeted by high winds and mountainous waves until destroyed, scattering the men over a wide area of storm-swept seas. About 100 of the men were lost. Others were picked up by passing ships from 1 to 4 days after the storm had abated. In October 1906, during the construction of Long Key Viaduct, a tropical hurricane swept over the Florida Keys and wrought great destruction to plant and equipment, as well as to the completed embankment at exposed points. Here we see a train passing over the completed Long Key Viaduct. Let's turn our attention now to the 7 Mile Bridge, shown as the middle bridge on the map. The longest of all structures is the 7 Mile Bridge, commenced in 1909 and completed in 1912. This bridge consists of 3 component sections. Firstly, 335 80-foot and 60-foot deck plate girder spans of steel resting on concrete piers. Secondly, a concrete viaduct 1 3/4 miles in length, consisting of 210 53-foot arches. Finally, a drawbridge 253 feet in length. Altogether, the bridge contains 546 concrete foundation piers, far exceeding the number in any other bridge in the world at that time. Each of the piers in the main structure rests on bedrock, as much, in some places, as 28 feet below the waterline. This was the costliest structure of all to build, and needless to say, presented many formidable engineering problems, too numerous to mention here. During the construction of this bridge, 2 severe hurricanes, one in September 1909, the other in September 1910, interrupted the work and wrought great damage to the floating equipment and some damage to the structure itself. During one storm, 5 deck plate girder spans, which had not been securely bolted into place, were blown from the bridge and into the sea. While on the subject of the major bridges, now let's discuss the Bahia Honda Bridge, which is the one on the far left on the map. The third great bridge is between Bahia Honda and Spanish Harbor Key, known as the Bahia Honda Bridge. It is 5,055 feet in length. This bridge consists of 13 through-truss spans, each 138 feet in length, 13 through-truss spans, each of 186 feet in length, and one span of 247 feet, as well as 9 deck plate girder spans, each 80 feet in length. Here the channel is 24 feet deep. At low tide, the greatest depth encountered at any point along the route. For this reason, a different type of construction was adopted, namely through-truss spans, which enabled the foundation piers to be spaced further apart than could be done with the deck plate girder type or concrete arch type of construction. At Key West, a major project was the construction of the terminal site, which involved dredging to reclaim 240 acres of land from the sea. Another major project at Key West was the construction of a permanent pier 1,700 feet in length, 134 feet in width, to accommodate large ocean-going vessels. Both of these projects required the shifting of many millions of cubic yards of material and the construction of thousands of feet of retaining walls. While this project was getting underway, the commandant of the naval station took steps to halt the work on the grounds that the Navy might at some point need to use the bay area from which the mud was being taken for target practice, in which case shallow water would be desirable. Mr. Parrott, then president of the railroad company, assured the Navy Department that if the mud were ever needed, the railway company would return it to its original location. Interestingly enough, the Navy now occupies the terminal area which the railroad made. All fresh water for use of locomotives, steamboats, and other watercrafts, stationary engines, as well as water for washing, bathing, cooking, and human consumption, was unobtainable on the Keys and had to be hauled long distances over land and water to the construction sites. Water requirements for a single month ranged up to 4.5 million gallons. This was equal to 700 carloads a month. Never before or since has a railway construction project of such magnitude been so completely dependent upon watercraft. Never before had a railway construction project of such magnitude been carried to completion with as little animal-drawn or motor-driven equipment. In the early days of construction, a few mules were employed on the grading work. Aside from that, not a horse or a mule or a wagon or a motor car was employed in the construction between the mainland of Florida and Key West. In the early stages of construction, the water was towed from Miami to the Keys by steamboats. Later it was taken from Manatee Creek in the Everglades. Later, water from deep wells near Homestead was shipped to the Keys in cypress tanks on flat cars. 2 tanks to a car, each car holding about 7,000 gallons. Materials of every sort known to construction work were necessary. Because of lack of docking facilities at some points, many of these ships anchored offshore and their cargoes were unloaded on lighters and towed to points where needed. Thousands of tons of cement, miles of reinforcing iron, miles upon miles of heavy deck plate girders and fabricated steel, and shiploads upon shiploads of cement, gravel, crushed rock, coal, and other supplies had to be brought to the project from long distances. At the height of construction, there was never a time when steamships or 4 or 5 masted schooners with construction materials were not unloading cargo at some point in the construction zone or in the high seas bound for the project. All cement used below the high tide line was of German manufacture, brought to the project direct from Germany. Cement for that part of the structure above the waterline was, of course, American, most of it bought in ships from a plant in New York State. Sand and gravel were bought in ships from points as far distant as Chesapeake Bay, and crushed rock from points as far away as the Hudson River. Many miles of temporary wooden trestles were erected to carry the railroad across channels while the permanent structures were being built. Many others were constructed to reach mile deposits and to provide docking facilities. Altogether, 35 miles of temporary wooden trestles were built during the construction period. Besides, large quantities of pilings were used for foundation piers, docks, anchor piles, and so on. At least 70,000 units of piling were used in the construction. The wood used for these pilings is jacaro, which is more impervious to the teredo and other destructive water insects. The magnitude of the construction is better understood when explained that each of the huge piers in the main channels of the 7-mile bridge required a mixture of sand, gravel, cement, and other materials equal in bulk to the entire cargo of a 4-masted schooner. From the inception of the project, a major problem was that of obtaining satisfactory engineers and construction men for supervisory purposes. These men were drawn from all parts of the world, and they were selected with great care. Many of them had been employed on other great construction projects and were accustomed to handling men. Equally difficult was the problem of obtaining ordinary skilled and unskilled labor. Advertisements were inserted in northern newspapers. Recruiting agencies were engaged in New York, Philadelphia, and other cities. And in a period of 5 or 6 years, at the height of construction, upwards of 40,000 different men were brought from New York and other distant cities to the project. Yet at no time did the total construction force ever exceed 5,000 men. Some men worked for years without interruption, many others worked only a few months, still others but a few days. One of the largest groups of laborers and some of the most dependable workers came from the 3 British islands of Grand Cayman, Little Cayman, and Cayman Brac in the Caribbean Sea. Each year, mostly in January, hundreds of these men came in their own vessels, the type commonly used in the fishing and turtle trades. These Caymanders worked steadily, with rarely a day lost, until 2 weeks before Christmas each year. Then they would quit, almost to a man, take their boats, and go home to spend the holidays with their families. A mixture of British and West Indian, many of these Caymanders had sandy complexions with red or blonde hair. 2/3 of them bore one of 3 surnames, that of either Jackson, Sands, or Eubanks. By all accounts, they were good workers. The most numerous group consisted of the common Skid Row American transients, recruited chiefly in New York and shipped to the Keys with the understanding that they would reimburse the railway company for their transportation to Jacksonville or Key West. A great many of them were down and outers, representing just about every occupation and profession. A record was kept of occupations and professions represented by these men, so that persons of special skills could be located if and when needed. The list included lawyers, doctors, pharmacists, sculptors, preachers, artists, actors, salesmen, teachers, and about every other profession and occupation imaginable. All of these men started as laborers on the roughest kind of work, such as shoveling coal, sand, and gravel, unloading ships, pushing wheelbarrows, building embankments, drilling and blasting rock, and so on. In spite of the care taken to select only men fitted for the work, much trouble was experienced with incompetence, and with those who hired on with no other idea than to get a trip to Florida at the railroad's expense. Out of this attitude grew a peonage charge, which resulted in a federal indictment of the engineers in charge. These charges received highly sensational treatment in the press. When, after hard fighting, the railroad succeeded in bringing the case to a trial, the result was a verdict of acquittal. At the same time, the court rebuked the prosecuting attorney for wasting its time with a charge which had such a flimsy foundation. Peonage, also called debt slavery or debt servitude, is a system where an employer compels a worker to pay off a debt with work. Legally, peonage was outlawed by Congress in 1867. Workers were often unable to repay the debt and found themselves in a continuous work without pay cycle. One of the most vexing of all problems connected with the construction of the Key West extension was the presence of mosquitoes and sandflies. During the period of construction, 3 severe hurricanes swept over the Keys, that being in 1906, 09, and 1910. Refuge canals were dredged at sheltered points in readiness for the storms. Floating equipment would be moved from the construction sites to these canals and kept there until the storm had passed. After the severe storm of 1909, it became apparent to the engineers that the coralline limestone rock then being used to protect the embankments was not adequate to perform that function under severe conditions. In numerous instances, blocks of stone and other material being used to protect the embankments were washed out to sea, leaving huge gaps. Damage from hurricanes and precautions taken had the effect of delaying completion of the work for 2 or 3 years and added millions of dollars to the cost. It was discovered that whenever marl had been placed on the embankment, the railroad had withstood the storms without serious destruction. The engineers then decided that marl was the answer to their problem. Several marl deposits were located up and down the Keys. Trestles were built out over to these deposits, dredges were bored in, and Goodwin dump cars were employed to carry the marl to exposed parts of the embankment. The marl thus dumped contained sufficient moisture to run off gradually, forming a rather smooth beach-like protective coating. Altogether, millions of yards of marl were deposited over the exposed areas of the embankment. Thereafter, hurricane tides washed over miles of exposed sections of track without doing serious damage. Marl or marlstone is a calcium carbonate or lime-rich mud or mudstone which contains variable amounts of clays and silt. The dominant carbonate mineral in most marls is calcite, but other carbonate minerals such as aragonite, dolomite, and siderite may also be present. As planned weeks in advance, Chief Engineer Crome and his men brought the construction of the line to a sufficient state of completion to enable trains to operate through to Key West. The greatest day in the history of the Florida Keys and in the life of Henry M. Flagler was January the 22nd, 1912. On that day, Henry Flagler rode into Key West on a special train, accompanied by scores of distinguished guests, and there, on his arrival, was given the greatest ovation of his life. Key West had declared a 3-day holiday to celebrate the occasion, and it seemed as if the entire population was present to witness the arrival of the first railway train most of them had ever seen, and welcomed the man who had made it possible. In a brief speech, Flagler, then 83 years old, said with a full heart, "Now I can die happy, my dream is fulfilled." This photograph shows the jubilation at the arrival of Flagler with the first train to enter Key West. Here are some more pictures of the celebration. A few months later, Florida's great benefactor passed away. In cities and towns up and down the East Coast, from Jacksonville to Key West, flags drooped in mourning, and at many points schools and churches paid tribute they had never before paid anyone, tolling their bells for the man who had done more than any other for that part of the state. The railroad to Key West continued in operation for a period of 23 years. Labor Day 1935, one of the most destructive hurricanes that ever visited the Florida Keys, inflicted severe damage to the many miles of embankment, not, however, to the great steel and concrete bridge structures which form the vital part of the project. At that time, the nation was in the throes of a Great Depression. The Florida East Coast Railway was in receivership. Economic conditions had undergone a marked change since Flagler decided to build the railroad to Key West. Improved highways, automobiles, motor buses, and trucks had become important factors in transportation. Seagoing car ferries operated between New Orleans and Havana had seriously affected the flow of traffic over the Florida East Coast Railway. Trade with Cuba was at a low ebb. These and other factors had so greatly changed the picture that the decision was reached to abandon the road south of Florida City, rather than to spend the money necessary to restore it to workable condition. Consequently, that part of the railroad was sold to the state of Florida and eventually converted to the Overseas Highway. This graphic shows the path of the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. This photo shows the devastating blow that the hurricane had on the railroad. And again, more devastation that led to the demise of the railroad. The Florida East Coast Railway and its offspring, the Overseas Highway, stand as monuments to the memory of that great man, as symbols of his indomitable courage and his faith in the future of this good land. While the Overseas Highway today runs along the former Overseas Railroad right-of-way, portions of the highway came into existence earlier in a different alignment while the railroad was still operational. The concept of an overseas highway began with the Miami Motor Club in 1921. The Florida land boom of the 1920s was underway, and the club wanted to attract tourists to easily reached fishing areas, which could only be reached by boat or train at the time. The land boom also attracted real estate interests who sought vehicular access to the upper Keys, where there were thousands of acres of undeveloped land. The completion of the railroad further proved a highway through the Keys was feasible. Since the 1950s, the Overseas Highway has been refurbished into a main coastal highway between the cities of Miami and Key West, offering travelers an exotic roadway through a tropical savanna environment and access to the largest area of coral reefs on the U.S. mainland. The Bahia Honda Bridge pictured here initially had the overseas highway mounted on top of the original railroad bridge. The text on the plaque reads, "The bridge spanning the 5,055-foot Bahia Honda Channel was part of the East Coast Railway built by oil mogul Henry Flagler between 1905 and 1912. The road was built on top of the railway bridge in 1938 as part of the original overseas highway. Use of this bridge stopped in 1972. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching.